All right, if we can, okay, there, see, Henry, you're right on the job back there, my friend. All right, well, this next talk isn't going to be nearly as much fun as the last one. I'm sorry to report, because we have to talk about probably the most serious event in Shroud history in the modern era. That was the 1988 radiocarbon dating of the Shroud, which proclaimed it a medieval hoax or fake, even though all the other evidence pointed in the opposite direction. So what I'm going to do, now this is, like I said, this is a little more academic because this is a rather technical subject. Look, I'm not a physicist, so don't worry, I'm not going to come at you that way. But I am going to have to give you some background and explain things because you all know about the STIRP team and what we did. Well, the problem was, the STIRP team, as I implied in my first lecture, we came back with lots of information and spent 3 years reducing it all down and publishing it into peer-reviewed journals, but as I showed you at the end of the first talk, we were really unable to answer the question, how is the image formed? We could tell you what it's not, but we couldn't tell you what it was. Not a painting, not a scorch, not a photograph. We proved all that, and that's in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. The team then, let me just start, because I think I already say that up here. Thanks. Yeah, and you can kill the lights on me. They don't need to see me anymore. That's what's important. So, after our team ended in October 81, and there will be more reading in this talk than there was in the first, sorry. Our work was all published in journals, and at that point in time, some of the guys moved on. They were done, they completed their work, published their results, and moved on to do other things. Some others decided that they would stick around and maybe do further research, and in 1984, an attempt was made to put together STIRP 2. STIRP 2, again, they put together a test plan that had 26 different experiments. Some of them were designed to answer questions raised by the new data we brought back the years before. Some of them were just to further our understanding of the Shroud. And the final 26th test was radiocarbon dating. So we too were hoping to be able to do radiocarbon dating. Our 26th test point plan was submitted to somebody you might have heard of. His name was Cardinal Ratzinger at the time. Ultimately became Pope Benedict. Cardinal Ratzinger is probably the most knowledgeable pope about the Shroud of Turin of all of them, at least in the modern era. Cardinal Ratzinger approved our plan, thought it was wonderful, forwarded it on to John Paul II, who was the Pope at the time. Saint John Paul II, I should say. At any rate, that plan was submitted to John Paul, and several members of the Pontifical Scientific Academy said, no, you can't let those Americans, they'll do harm to the Shroud. Now remember how careful we were? Stainless steel, magnets, no thumbtacks. So they were worried about us? No. I hate to tell you this, folks. This might come as a shock to you. Politics. That's what it was. Pope John Paul II denied our STIRP 2, and that was the end of it. They only kept one of the 26 tests we had suggested, and that, of course, was radiocarbon dating. So that's the background of it. So STIRP was out of the picture, basically. Now, in 1987, they held this symposium in Turin with all the radiocarbon dating laboratories coming together. And I'm sort of encapsulating what it says up there, but you can read it to get the detail. They started by suggesting there would be 7 laboratories that would do the testing, and then several months later, Professor Luigi Ganella, the referee between Jackson and Max Fry that you saw, announced that only 3 labs would do it. Well, Dr. Harry Goh, the guy who's credited with developing the radiocarbon dating AMS process used on the Shroud, immediately objected. Of course, he made a fatal mistake. You don't publish a letter to the Pope in the popular press. And that's what he did. and he immediately became persona non grata. His lab was excluded from the 7 original labs, and only 3 were chosen: Arizona, Zurich, and Oxford, the radiocarbon dating lab at Oxford University in England. So, in the end, they dated the shroud, and as you've all heard, they dated it and said it was medieval. Couldn't be any earlier. Well, I think I have a photo. I call this the Three Stooges. Anyway, have you ever seen a scientific announcement done the way they did it in front of a blackboard with the dates 1260 to 1390, exclamation point? Huh? Exclamation point, new form of scientific notation, obviously. And there was a certain arrogance about these guys. They said 1260 was the earliest possible date. Well, that didn't jive well with those of us who had done any historical research on the shroud, because we knew about this. This is called the Hungarian Prey Codex, or Prey manuscript, and it's a small illuminated manuscript that still exists in Budapest in the museum there today. And the illustration, the artist, first of all, remember that all the depictions of Jesus you have ever seen, not counting the shroud, shown with a modesty cloth, right? You've all seen that, covered up. No. This illustration shows a naked Jesus with his hands folded across his body, the same as on the shroud. It shows an attempt to duplicate the zigzag pattern of the herringbone weave. And here's remember those L-shaped burn holes from the first lecture? Well, what do you know? There they are. So whoever this artist was that illuminated this manuscript obviously had seen the shroud, because he got the pose right, he got the complete nudity, which is almost unheard of in any religious artworks, and he got the herringbone weave and the L-shaped burn hole. So all of us who knew about this, the date of this is 1190 or 1191, 70 years earlier than the earliest carbon date it said it could be. So right off the bat, we knew something was wrong. Hear about that? How about that? You think the artist made this up out of the clear blue, or do you think he might have seen that on the shroud? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. He even got the orientation right, basically. And look, the shroud was folded in 4 when these L-shaped burn holes were burnt into the cloth. Some people call them poker holes. They are not poker holes, okay? I'm very firm about that, and I've argued with Ian Wilson, the well-known shroud historian and author, who labeled them poker holes because it's another dramatic attempt at destroying the shroud. And Ian's a writer, so he looks for the drama. But they're not poker holes, because if you heat a metal poker and you start poking this piece of cloth, every hole is going to be pretty much the same. Look at these. These are jagged, ragged, and completely random. And when we know the cloth was folded in quarters, I think I can show you that. There you go. So you can see all the layers. Top layer, second layer, third layer, fourth layer. When you fold the shroud into quarters like that, it would fit nicely on an altar. Now, what on an altar might cause something to get burned like that? Well, how about the censer with the incense that the priest will often swing? What if some of the hot coals or incense fell out onto the cloth? They would burn ragged little random holes like that onto the cloth. So that's a very plausible thing. Now, when they did the restoration of 2002, which I didn't really talk a lot about, they scraped away the char around all these holes. Had they not done that, we might have done chemical analysis. We know what the compounds are that are found in incense or charcoal. We might have been able to determine if the theory that maybe an incense may have been the cause of that, but they scraped all that away and didn't keep it separate, so we can never know now. That's why the restoration of 2002 was such a frustrating, kind of near tragic event. Anyway, knowing this information really made a lot of us wonder, what the heck? Now, you know, I'm not a physicist. I think you've already figured that out. So I wasn't qualified to go challenge the radiocarbon dating guys, but that's what they did. So let's talk about what the sample was. Now, I'm going to tell you something right up front. What I'm about to present to you is not accepted by everybody in the shroud world. even the pro-authenticity people. There are a lot of theories of what was wrong with the radiocarbon dating. Most of them attack the process itself, which is a pretty well-known, pretty tried and true process. It's pretty hard to attack that, except in a few rare occasions. So the radiocarbon dating of the shroud, there were for 12 years, people were coming up with all these wild ideas of what went wrong, and it was a bioplastic coating, but there was no bioplastic coating. Our microscopic work proved that. So all these theories presented and all eventually discarded. For 12 years, we were sort of in those dark days of nobody knew what was going on. Until 2001. 2000, the year 2000. There was a conference held in Orvieto in Italy. And at that conference, two researchers, Sue Benford and Joe Marino, got up and presented a paper saying that they had done some testing and they had gotten photographs of the various carbon dating samples from the different labs, and they presented them to a textile expert in Ohio. And the textile expert looked at it and said, oh, look, it's a herringbone weave. They didn't know, the textile experts didn't know it was shroud that they were looking at, just a photo of a close-up of a woven textile. So they took it to one textile expert, and that expert said, hey, there looks like there's been some manipulation or reweaving done on this cloth. Okay, so Benford and Reno, they weren't expecting that. That was not why they presented the samples. So they went to another textile expert. Just, that's the way good science is done. They went to another textile expert, and the same thing happened. The expert looked at it and said, somebody's manipulated this very skillfully, but it's obvious by some of the weave here, somebody has done some reweaving in this area. Well, Benford and Marino were a little bit surprised to get this twice, and they decided to go to the horse's mouth. They went to Thomas Ferguson Irish Linen in Ireland, and the chief researcher at Thomas Ferguson, a woman, took one look and she said, oh, this has been rewoven using French invisible reweaving. Nobody had ever heard of French invisible reweaving, so much so that when Benford and Marino announced this publicly, the folks in Turin said no such technique even exists. And then a few months later, somebody sent me a book called it's called The French Invisible Reweaving, Preserving an Ancient Art Form. So we know that it did exist. There's even a book trying to save and rescue it because it was very expensive. It was perfected by the French court about the same time the shroud was in France. What a coincidence, huh? So, Benford and Marino make their presentation. I'm sitting in the front row with my camera, which I usually do at these conferences. And they come off the stage after presenting this paper. It's the first paper that presented an idea of what went wrong with the carbon dating without attacking carbon dating itself. They said, no, it's simple. They only chose one sample from that whole piece of cloth, and that one sample happened to come from an area that had been manipulated and repaired. Now that was plausible, and it was something you don't need to be a physicist to understand. So, they present this theory. They're coming out the stage. I say, you gotta let me put that on Shroud.com. They said, sure. I put it on Shroud.com, I don't know, 24 hours after I put it on the internet. I got a phone call from the chemist, Ray Rogers, from the STIRP team from Los Alamos. And I can't tell you exactly what he said, but I'll give you a clue. He said, what kind of stuff are you putting on your website? I said, what do you mean, Ray? He said, well, these people aren't scientists. They're the lunatic fringe. And they're doing it just by visual without doing any chemistry. He was a chemist. I said, well, Ray, did you read the paper? He says, you know what? He says, I've got some material in my safe that we've never used from 1978. Give me 5 minutes, I'm going to prove them wrong. I said, go for it, Ray. About an hour and a half later, phone rings again. It's Ray Rogers. He's much more quiet, sedate. And he said, I can't believe it. I said, what, Ray? I think they're right. He set out to prove them wrong, and in the end, just the opposite occurred. He had a piece taken from the shroud. Now, see if I've got that in here. Yeah, let's talk about this, and I'll come back to that in a sec. But I just want you to know that this theory I'm presenting to you today is not widely accepted by everybody. My dear friend Paolo De Lazzaro, the physicist in Rome, He doesn't accept it. And here's my attitude. There are now 2 peer-reviewed scientific papers in the credible scientific literature that challenge the radiocarbon dating. And those are the ones I'm going to tell you about today. Now, maybe there is some other answer to this, but until better science comes along, I'm obligated to stay within the realm of science, the peer-reviewed science, and consequently, what I'm going to talk to you about here is the work of Benford, Marino, and Rogers. Okay, so what did they take for the sample? This is important. Now there's the image of the shroud, and look up in that one little corner up there. See that little strip? That's the piece they cut. They cut that off. See if I can make this work. There you go. They cut it in half and put half aside. That was called the reserve sample. They took the other half and divided it in thirds and delivered it to the 3 laboratories. Now, when they took the samples out, the original radiocarbon protocol called for them to do chemical analysis of the sample before they destroyed them, because radiocarbon dating, you carbonize it, you burn it, and capture the gases, and that's what you set your counter to read. Anyway, they didn't do any chemical analysis of the thing before they burned it. So now we have this tiny little sample that each lab got. And by the way, the 3 labs didn't agree with each other. There was a range of dates depending where on that strip of cotton that they dated. So there was something strange about the sample in that area in the first place. Let's continue here. Oh yeah. Now, if I were going to create an illustrated dictionary, I would use that photo for the word arrogance. These are the, now, you know, it's kind of sad that there were 3 laboratories chosen in the end. I've mentioned them to you. And then they chose a man named Dr. Michael Type, chief researcher at the British Museum in England, to supervise and oversee the 3 labs. After the radiocarbon dating results were released, Oxford University received £1 million sterling for debunking the shroud. And Dr. Michael Type left the British Museum and took a permanent chair at Oxford on some of that money. How does that smell? Not so good. Anyway, they make this announcement, they do it, and what's really funny, there were all these different theories, as I mentioned, got discarded. Nobody was quite sure. Then Benford Marino come along. I'm sorry, I'm kind of jumping ahead. What I really liked was the fact that one of the guys from the Oxford lab referred to any of us who still believe the shroud was authentic as flat earthers. So for at least 12 years, I was a flat earther too. Anyway, continuing on, I'm going to go through some of this quickly. I already told you all this, and I already told you, sorry, I'm kind of jumping ahead, but that's good because I want to get through this as quickly and as painlessly as I can. Let me just show you some of these images. So here we go. This is what Benford Marino showed to the textile experts. And you and I look at this, we couldn't, that all looks the same. But to a seasoned expert in textiles, they immediately, 3 in a row, identified a reweaving going on in this particular set of samples. As a matter of fact, Benford Marino went to Beta Analytic, the largest radiocarbon dating lab in the United States. And Beta Analytic figured out that if there was 40% first century and 60% newer material added, you'd get a date of around 1200. How about that? That's about the date that they got. So this is a plausible possibility. Okay, I already told you this story. Okay, this is the one I was looking for. So this is just a natural color photo from that corner. Remember, in 1978, the corner where they took the sample, way down in that corner, wasn't relevant to what we were doing. We were interested in the image. So we don't have any great close-ups of that area the way it appeared then. This is cropped from my larger photo. But if you'll look, this is the seam, and to the right of the seam, you see the darker area there? That's not a shadow, folks. It's a different color. Now, why is it a different color? Well, according to Ray Rogers, when somebody rewove that area, they then had to apply a dye to match new material to the color of the older material. That dye he was able to chemically analyze it. It was madder root dye from anyway, rose madder from the madder root plant. That's what I'm trying to say. And it was applied with a gum Arabic base, so he could chemically analyze and find what was there. We didn't find that anywhere else on the shroud, just in this one area. So we're looking at that. Now, remember I said Rogers had a piece in his safe. This piece was cut in 1973 by Professor Reyes. Rogers had been given some fibers from that little triangular chunk. That's what he had in his safe. And he told me that when he first looked at them, he got these in '79 after we came back from Italy, from Professor Reyes. He said when he looked at them, he thought he found cotton in them. And so he thought, well, these can't be from the shroud. And he just put them in his safe and never messed with them again until Benford Marino came out. When he pulled it out, Benford Marino pointed out that the reason cotton was interwoven in that area, and ladies, you might know this better than the guys do, cotton's a lot easier to dye than linen. Linen has kind of a waxy outer surface, has to be sort of pre-treated, where cotton is easy to dye. So why did they use cotton? Well, here's the other thing. Jewish law says that this must be pure, clean linen. That means no mixing of the kinds, no cotton or wool interwoven, not permitted by Jewish law. And yet in this corner, we find cotton interwoven with the shroud. Very suspect, and consequently, part of why Benford Marino came out with this theory. This is an infrared, or rather UV fluorescence photograph, again showing that that area is darker than the surrounding areas. And ironically, the strip that they cut out was right here, right along to the right of that seam. So it's not, there's none of it left there today. So we can't go back and verify. So it's kind of frustrating. Anyway, those samples, when Rogers pulled that out of his safe, he understood that he couldn't use that in a peer-reviewed paper because it had been in his safe for 25 or 30 years. And so he needed the provenance of a more accurate sample. However, he was smart enough to look back at some of the other STIRP data, and lo and behold, this is called the quad mosaic. Now here's the close-up. There's that little triangular patch. There's the seam. Notice to the right of the seam, it's kind of greenish. Then it becomes the warmer tone colors of the shroud. Now this is false colorized, but different chemical compounds are what are being shown here. Doesn't tell us what the chemicals are, it just shows us a difference. Notice that the patch, which we expect to be different from the shroud, is sort of greenish, but look to the right of that seam, in that same area that pulled the carbon dating sample from, different color. So he looked at that, and then he looked and he found an end-to-end splice in the middle of the sample. There are no splices on the shroud. When you're putting a cloth on the loom and you're weaving it, when you get to the end of one hank of yarn, you take the next one, you overlap it, slam it down, and keep going. You don't have to splice the ends together. And yet we're finding end-to-end splices, only in one place. There's a microscopic view of it. Now, Rogers was a smart guy, and he knew that he could not just rely on his own eyes. So, let's see what I've got here. Yeah, so he contacted a researcher, an independent researcher in Atlanta, scientist, material scientist, a man who had no interest in the shroud or no involvement with the shroud, John Brown. John Brown, I always laugh, because John Brown had 25 microscopes set up in his house, including on his dining room table, a scanning electron microscope. I'm sure his wife was thrilled about that. And so John Brown was really a master with a microscope. So Rogers sends his work down to John Brown for independent evaluation. So, what happens? He writes a paper pointing out everything that Rogers had found and then some. He totally agreed with Rogers. Now, here's something that John Brown thought of that even Rogers didn't think of. When you weave a fiber, or weave a cloth, you have warp fibers that cross weft fibers. Or maybe I said that backwards, but one crosses over the other. If somebody had applied a dye after a reweave, then there wouldn't be any dye where one crossed over the other, would there? So John Brown separated them, and what did he find? 2 undyed areas with a warp across the weft, and even ultraviolet fluorescence microscopy showed that the undyed areas did not fluoresce. John Brown further verified all that Rogers said, and he also found cotton interwoven, forbidden by Jewish law. Cotton interwoven, you notice cotton fibers are kind of flat, ribbon-like. There were some modern cotton fibers on the surface of the cloth from our white cotton gloves, but this was interwoven in the radiocarbon dating sample area. And Rogers had found a particulate on the surface, the rose madder dye and the gum arabic. John Brown found it. He was able to capture it photographically through his microscope. I told you he had a scanning electron microscope in the dining room. There's some of his SEM images. So basically what John Brown did was verified independently all of Rogers, Benford, and Moreno's findings. But remember, Rogers understood that that sample that he'd been using, the Reyes sample, wasn't going to cut it if he wanted to submit a new paper. He needed to get a new piece, preferably right from the radiocarbon sample itself. And remember the reserve piece that they cut in half and separated and set aside? Rogers requested and received a portion of that reserve sample that would have been right about in the middle of that strip that was cut out. And Rogers tested it and found exactly all the same stuff. So this verified Rogers' belief. Hold on, I just told you all this. Anyway, the sample he obtained was with provenance. In other words, there was a documented chain of custody of that sample, so everybody knew where it had been. This is what you need to do good science, particularly on something as controversial as the Shroud. You want to make sure you have all your T's crossed, etc. So, Rogers puts it all together into a paper and submits it to a journal called Thermochimica Acta. You all read that, don't you? That's what I thought. Anyway, it appeared in the January 20th issue. And there it is. That is the first peer-reviewed science to challenge the radiocarbon dating in the credible scientific literature. Sadly, this is, there's some of the particulates that he photographed through his microscope, where you can see, let's see if I can point it out, look, you can see the gum arabic kind of on the side of the fiber here. You can see all the particulates in there, which are the dye. And this is what Rogers concluded in his paper. I'm going to go through it pretty quick, because the last one's really the most important one. This is what Ray Rogers concluded, that the date was not valid because the sample was not valid for determining the accurate age of the shroud. Now, are there any card-carrying scientists in the room? I asked that before, didn't I? Did I get anybody's hands up? No. Well, I've asked this question probably 500 times in the last 20 years. How many scientists will accept a 95% certainty on a result based on a single sample? And every scientist I've ever spoken to says, you can't do that. You can't claim 95% certainty on one test. One test performed 3 times by 3 different labs, each with a different result. He said, no, there were no control samples taken elsewhere. That's bad science. But £1 million is a lot of inspiration. Now, look, I'm not accusing anybody of, the bribing or any of that. I don't mean that. My question is simply this. When did the people at Oxford find out they were going to get £1 million? Did they have any inkling of that before they dated the shroud? Or was that a surprise to them afterwards? Don't know, they're not talking. Half of them are dead. We'll never know. Radiocarbon dating is now a $4 billion a year industry, and they used the debunking of the Shroud of Turin to popularize the technique. They'll never go back and say they did anything wrong because nobody bites the hand that feeds them. And that's kind of sad, but that's the truth. 5 weeks after the paper comes out, Rogers goes. He dies. He'd been dying for years. He had prostate cancer, 20-some years. Eventually it took him. But he had just enough time to complete what became his most important work on the shroud. May he rest in peace. Okay, oops, sorry, went too quick. Benford Marino in 2008, they published in a journal called Chemical Oggi. You all read that, that's Italian, it means chemistry today. It's actually a very highly ranked English language journal published in Italy. Their paper further supports the conclusions that they drew with Rogers and Brown and Benford Marino. Now when Rogers died, he left me his shroud stuff, and including his samples, his tape samples, and the Reyes sample, the end-to-end splice. It was missing in the group of materials his wife sent me before I was able to get the contents of his computer to try and figure out what happened to that most important splice end-to-end sample. But eventually I got the contents, and I found that 1 week before he died, Rogers had contacted a guy at Los Alamos National Laboratory named Bob Villarreal and given him the sample for him to do some further testing on the new technology they had at the lab. So now it's a couple years after Rogers dies, and you know, Los Alamos is a weapons lab. You're not supposed to be able to call and say, Bob there? And get Bob on the phone, but I did just that. I called up Los Alamos National Laboratories, said in my most professional sounding voice, Robert Villarreal, please, 1 moment. He gets on the phone. Hi, this is Bob. I go, Bob, you don't know me, but I was a friend of Ray Rogers, and I said, he gave you a sample just before he died. Do you still have it? He said, well, yeah, I was trying to give it back to his wife, but she was so distraught at his death. And then, you know, things got busy and I kind of forgot about it. So, you still have it, right? Oh, yeah, I still have it. I said, well, listen, now remember, this is going through my head. Ray Rogers picked this guy to give him his most important piece of the shroud. Just a couple of fibers. If it's good enough for Ray Rogers, certainly good enough for me. So I said, listen, Bob, would you be willing to continue working with me the way you were working with Ray to further complete the analysis of these samples? And he said, oh yeah, as a matter of fact, since Ray's death, we've gotten 2 new instruments at the lab that'll go even better than what we had before. And so Bob Villarreal gets 7 more of his colleagues together, and they had analyzed the heck out of these samples. And they published their work completely agreeing with everything Benford Marino and John Brown and Ray Rogers found. They verified it all. That's 8 Los Alamos National Laboratory scientists. I'd say they're pretty credible. And I'd say that what they did was further corroborate that there was something anomalous about the sample you'd chosen. Okay, I'm going to kind of skip through this because Joe Marino eventually, oh, by the way, the sadness after Benford Marino's paper was published, about 2 months later, Sue Benford died of breast cancer at age 51, sadly. Again, God gave her enough time to finish her work and get it out there, and then took her. So Joe Marino, after mourning, I get this phone call. This guy, Ed Pryor, calls me up. Now, you know, when you're talking to somebody really smart, you can tell. You know what I mean? You can just tell from the conversation. So we're talking. Finally, he says, I said, listen, Mr. Pryor, you're a scientist. He goes, well, I'm kind of retired. I said, really? What did you do before you retired? I was Chief Scientist, Langley Research, NASA. Oh, is that all? And he's asking me all these questions about any history about repairs to the shroud. And Joe Marino had been asking me the same question. And look, Joe Marino, sadly enough, for some of you, I'm sure, when I tell you this, is a former priest. And he left it because his provincial said, you got to stop with the shroud, we need you to do other stuff. And Joe felt so compelled to continue his work on the shroud, he left the priesthood over it. Eventually, married Sue Benford, but that's not why he left the priesthood. I want to be real clear about that. Well, I mean, in all fairness to her memory, that's not why he married her. Anyway, So they put together this 39 or 40 page article, and we publish it. It's sort of a chronological history of all the repairs and stuff done. And within a month of our publishing that, they called me up and said, listen, we got another 20 pages to add. So you can find all that up on Shroud.com, and I don't want to spend too much time. But here's the thing. I've already shown you a whole bunch of evidence supporting the fact that the sample used was anomalous, did not represent the main body of the shroud. I believe there's enough evidence for me to stand in public, as I'm doing right now, and saying that this is the best answer we have right now. Whether or not it's 100% correct or not, if somebody comes along with better science after further examination of the shroud that disproves this, I'll be the first to stand up and say, and so would have Rogers and Benford and Marino and Villarreal and Brown. By the way, of all those people, the only one alive left is Joe Marino. Benford's gone, Rogers is gone, Brown is gone, Villarreal's gone. It's the bummer of getting old. You start losing all the people you love. Now, in all fairness, I want to give you this. This is John Jackson's theory. He was the co-founder of the STIRP team. This happened about 10 years ago. He decided, over 10 years ago, he went and talked to the new guy who's the head of the Oxford lab. See if his name's up there. Maybe it is. Anyway, he went and talked to the new director of the lab. His theory is that carbon monoxide had contaminated the sample, causing the date to be skewed. The only problem with that theory is, if that were true, every radiocarbon dating ever done would be wrong. Do you think, even if Jackson were right, do you think that those guys are ever going to say that? No. So, but in all fairness, that's his theory. Now, almost 11 years now have passed since this occurred, and nothing has ever come out of it because it's unlikely that carbon monoxide skewed the date of the shroud. But because he was a member of the STIRP team, co-founder, I wanted to share Jackson's theory with you. Christopher Ramsey, I thought I had his name up there. Yeah, nothing ever came of it because carbon monoxide didn't skew the radiocarbon dating, probably not. So, the controversy isn't going to end just because we're talking about it, but let's see here. Oh, yeah, I just told you all that. So, until we have a better answer, this is what I'm telling you is the solution to the radiocarbon dating. Now, let me see how we doing time-wise. Let's see. We have about 20 minutes, if I'm correct. Is that right? Someone? So, what I wanted to do was to give you an opportunity to ask some questions. See, I told you this talk wasn't going to be nearly as much fun as that first one. That's why I gave you the first one first. Kind of soften you up a little. Because this was a basis for one of my courses at the Pontifical University in Rome. And I've sort of simplified it somewhat to present to a more general audience. So with that in mind, if you have a question, since I only have one microphone, I don't know how we're going to do this. Well, I'll tell you what, you give me the question, I'll repeat it. How's that? Any questions? Put up your hand, here we go. Yes, this young lady here. What does STIRP stand for? Shroud of Turin Research Project. Somehow it became, first if you saw on the crates it was STRP, but there wasn't a vowel. So somebody bought a vowel and put it in there to make it STIRP instead of strip. Much easier to say STIRP. But that's all it stands for. Just an acronym for the name. Someone over here, young lady back there. Who would have to give us authority to do another test? One man, the Pope. The Pope, 1983, King Umberto died. I think I mentioned this in the first lecture. By 1986, the will was probated, and the Pope became the legal owner. The living Pope became the legal owner of the shroud, with one stipulation: the shroud can never leave Turin. So the shroud will always be the Shroud of Turin now. Well, it's been there for, 450 years now? Something like that. So, did I answer your question? Okay. Sorry. It's already been a long day. Yes, ma'am. Why Turin? Good question. Why Turin? Turin was the seat of power of the Savoy family that owned the Shroud for over 500 years. At one point in the 1800s, they were considering making that the capital of Italy because they were the monarchy. But 1946, the end of the war, they'd gotten rid of Mussolini. They didn't want one man in charge of anything anymore. They exiled the king and his family over to Portugal, and that was the end of the monarchy in Italy. But Turin was their seat of power, and that's where they brought the Shroud in 1578, and so that's where it's going to stay. And of course, it's great for the economy of Turin when they do pull it out and show it every 20 or so years. Next one, I think I told you, is the 2025, the next holy year of the Catholic Church. All the way in the back. How is the Shroud currently stored? Great question. It is in a steel, fireproof cabinet. Okay. It is in a nitrogen argon atmosphere. It is no longer rolled up, but just kept flat. It is light tight, fireproof, and temperature humidity controlled by computers. It is the best preserved today than it's ever been in its entire history. Yeah, follow up? Has there ever been a computer-generated image of the entire Shroud? Well, not so much of the Shroud, but of the man, yes. There was a television documentary called The Real Face of Jesus. It was on the History Channel. It was about 2 hours in length, and so it was a little long in my opinion. But they used some of my photographs, a guy named Ray Downing, who's got an Emmy Award for his beautiful animation, and he took the material, the image data from the Shroud, and then he artistically, besides enhancing into 3D, artistically put the skin color and the hair color and things of that nature into it. And you can find that, I'm sure it's online, but it's called The Real Face of Jesus. I think it was made in 2010, so it's been around for 8 or 9 years. But that was probably one of the best renditions of it. And others have done illustrations based on the Shroud. There are a number of famous ones. Starting back in 1935, there was the, what's his name? I'm having a mental block here. Okay, it doesn't matter. Ariel Adjemian, that's his name, an Armenian artist, did a beautiful face of Jesus based on the Shroud, and it's become very famous. It's all over the internet. You can look that one up too. But the best, I think, so far done digitally is the one by Ray Downing in The Real Face of Jesus. However, there have been sculptures like Luigi Mattei, who's an Italian sculptor, and he took the image of the man in the Shroud and created the way the man would be laying in the Shroud. And that's a bronze sculpture that maybe some of you have seen. It's at the center in Jerusalem there. Notre Dame Center in Jerusalem has a Shroud exhibit. There's one at the University in Rome. And I'm not sure if Father Dalton's in the room or not, but they've now put them, I think there might be an exhibit in Mexico City, and all of those have bronze sculpture by Luigi Mattei, which is a beautiful piece of work. And there are others that have done it as well. So yes, this has been done on a number of occasions, but digitally I think the first one I mentioned by Real Face of Jesus is probably the best. Yes, sir?
With regards to the theory that you were indicating about the carbon monoxide, could that have been because of the fire that occurred, maybe the reliquary burning, and then a carbon that is not as depleted could have entered into the fabric, and then it would have appeared that it was later than earlier?
Okay, so the question is, since we know the Shroud was in a fire in 1532, perhaps there was a higher content of carbon monoxide or dioxide or whatever that might have impacted the potential carbon content of the cloth. And the answer to that is yes, but not enough to skew it 1,300 years, according to the physicists. Not my opinion. I'm just an old hippie photographer. But according to the physicists who are more qualified, they say not enough to skew it that far. Where the rewoven part could skew it in any direction you want, if that's what you got. In the back, yeah, gentlemen, yeah, right there.
The veil at Manipello.
Manipello.
That is similar to the crown, to the shroud, they say. How could both have the same image? If one could be on top of the other.
Have you seen the Manipello?
Yes.
Father and I disagree on this one too. It's an artwork, and personally, I don't believe a very good one. Now, I also know Father Heinrich Pfeiffer, German priest who promotes the Manipello as the Veronica. The only problem is the Veronica is not in the Gospels. That's a legend. Nothing in the Gospels about the Veronica.
But in Manipello, they say this veil was the veil that was placed on its face.
Right.
Below the crown.
Yeah, that's not at all what it is. Because the Sudarium of Oviedo, which they have in Spain, is the second face cloth. That's got his blood and his pleural fluids on it, but no image. Okay, so here's the thing. The Manipello, if you go to shroud.com, type Manipello in and pack a lunch, because there's plenty there to talk about, but I will refer you primarily to the work of Roberto Falcinelli, an Italian photographer, professional photographer, and a member of the Della Croce de Jerusalem Shroud group in Rome. He examined the Manipello and made photographs of it, and they say, oh, it's not a painting, but you can see the paint. They say it's made on byssus, which comes from shellfish, and they say you can't paint onto byssus, but there's paint on the Manipello, and nobody's done any chemical analysis to determine if that's byssus or not. It has not been subjected to nearly the same amount of study as the Shroud has, but the data that we have so far, remember, I'm looking for science, okay? I know, but that's where I'm coming from. And right now the science points to it being a bad artwork and not anything to do with the Shroud or Jesus. And if you look at it, use your eyes. So I don't want to debate it. I'm just saying that, look, I've seen as much data as I've seen so far shows me this is not anything to get excited about. I could be wrong. I could be totally wrong about that. But right now, my evaluation based on the data we have is not so much. And look, I'm not the only one that feels that way, but people are divided. There's a smaller group who think it's real, and a much larger group that discounts it. Flip a coin, pick a side. I don't think we have enough data to be definitive. Young lady there.
Sir, based on the stains on the shroud, can you tell us again which side of the chest was pierced, the right or the left? And
Yes, I know, this is such a common problem. Which side of the body is the spear wound? Is that the one you're talking about? Yeah. Because in the gospel, it says he was speared in what side? The right side. So here's the thing. This is my right side, huh? Does it look like my right side? If you're looking at a picture of this, it would look like my left side, wouldn't it? Now, if you imagine a cloth laying over me and the blood soaks onto it, and you pull that cloth away and turn it around, guess what? Looks like it's on the left side of the man when in fact it's on the right side. One of the most confusing things about the Shroud is this left-right reversal business, especially because starting with the first photographs, they flipped it left to right in the negative, only adding another layer of confusion. It's the hardest thing to describe to people verbally, but it was the right side, just like it says in the Gospels. Yes, sir?
Is there any discussion as to whether the Shroud belongs to Pope Francis or Pope Emeritus Benedict?
Pope.
Pope Emeritus.
Oh, Benedict. Oh, it's that's a good question. I don't think anybody's ever asked me that. The way it was written, the question is, does the Shroud belong to Pope Francis or to the previous Pope, Pope Benedict? Because popes don't usually retire. I think it's the first time in 900 years or something like that, so it's not a common event even in the Catholic Church. I would believe, and again, this is just, I'm not a lawyer, I don't know, especially Italian law, the living Pope, but he's emeritus. He's no longer the Pope, so I think that when Francis took over, then it passed to him. That would make sense. But it's Italian law, I don't know for sure. Never, all bets are off. Yes, sir?
Has there been any attempt to match the DNA in the blood in the shroud to particularly Eucharistic miracles, such as Buenos Aires or Lanciano?
Lanciano. Yeah, the blood on the shroud ostensibly has been type 2 AB. The Rh factor may be positive or negative. Those enzymes are long gone, and there's not enough information there to determine what's called the rhesus factor. So we don't know if it's AB positive or negative. Lanciano's AB, Shroud's AB, Sudarium's AB. And that's another point of the Manipello. If it was on his face, underneath, it would have blood and fluids on it like the Sudarium does, and it doesn't. So that's another thing that I just thought of. So here's the problem with blood typing. Back in the days when Alan Adler was our lead blood expert in the shroud world, that was 40 years ago. The DNA technology has completely evolved since then. So some of if you read some of Adler's work, you'll see he wasn't talking about, when he talked about the blood, he wouldn't claim it was human blood. He was being careful and scientific. So he said, well, it's at least not human, but primate blood. That's what Al Adler said. That was him hedging his bets and trying to be a good scientist and not making a claim beyond what the data could show. Well, since then, we have new techniques, and we now have a new expert, Kelly Kearse, K-E-A-R-S-E, for anybody who's looking to look him up. He's on our board of directors now. He's both a blood and DNA expert, and he said that even calling the blood type AB or human blood type, he says, now we have better tests that could more firmly verify that than what Adler had available to him. So that question technically is still a little bit up in the air. Now, as far as DNA goes, that's a separate deal from blood type. And here's the problem with the DNA. I'm a long-haired Jewish guy. My DNA is on the cloth. And every other person who's leaned over it, touched it, kissed it, repaired it, breathed on it, prayed over it, everybody's DNA is on it. And then there was that restoration in 2002 where all the patches were removed, the backing sheet was removed, the charred areas were scraped away, vacuumed, and they steamed to get the creases out. They steamed parts of it, all terrible things to do to an old piece of cloth. And the woman who did the work was from Switzerland. She was a Swiss textile expert. And she handled the cloth for 32 days without gloves, hairnet, mask, or protective clothing. And so if we were to do a DNA test of the man of the shroud today, we'd find he was a Swiss woman. Not only that, she had a light about 18 inches or so for 32 days, overexposing it to ultraviolet unnecessarily. And when there was an outcry from the scientific community of why they weren't consulted, people in turn said, well, you're just jealous because you weren't invited. No. How about the fact that she destroyed some data that was potentially important, and had she consulted with others, she still could have done all the work she needed to do without damaging or losing the data that was ultimately lost. If you really want to read the details of the restoration, we have a whole page on Shroud.com dedicated to the 2002 restoration with comments from some of the most prominent researchers in the shroud world. So check that out and you'll see that 11 out of 12 gave it 2 thumbs down. One gave it a thumbs up. I won't mention his name, but it seemed to a lot of people after reading all the comments that one person was trying to curry favor with Turin. I said, oh, you did a great job, wonderful, blah, blah, blah. Then afterwards, that guy called me up and he said, that makes it look like I was trying to curry favor with Turin. What was I supposed to say? I go, you're right, it did look that way. He wasn't too happy. Well, hey, look, you're going to put yourself in writing and you're going to put it on the internet, you're committed. So you better think before you push that button. I know I do a lot of thinking before I push that button, which I do on a regular basis.